In this video, we're going to dig into the central nervous system, which is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. So here I'm drawing a side view of a person, and I'll draw in these components of the CNS, the central nervous system. So in red here is the brain up at the head, and in green, descending from the brain, is the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord has two primary functions. The first is to pass information between the brain and the periphery. So it acts sort of like a relay station passing information. And this can be motor signals and motor commands going out to the body from the brain, and it can be sensory information coming into the body up to the brain. A second function of the spinal cord is that it drives sensory reflexes and rhythmic motor patterns. So these are movements that occur that are driven by circuits of neurons that are contained within the spinal cord. So we don't have any inputs going up to the brain to drive these movements. So for example, for a sensory reflex, when you're at the doctor's office and you get hit on your knee and you kick your leg, that's a sensory reflex. And so the circuit that drives that response is contained within the spinal cord. Another example of a sensory reflex is when you touch a hot object and you immediately withdraw your hand away from the object before your brain even receives the message that you touched something hot. So later you realize you touched something hot, but you actually withdraw your hand before that signal reaches your brain because there's a local circuit in the spinal cord that drives that reflex. And for rhythmic movements, the spinal cord contains other local neural circuits that drive rhythmic motor patterns that we see in walking, breathing, intestinal contractions, and more. So if we zoom in on a section of the spinal cord, we see that the spinal cord is actually comprised of many segments. And in the human, we see about 30 segments, and these segments are called vertebrae, or the singular being vertebra. And off of each vertebra comes peripheral nerves that go out to the periphery. And these either send motor signals out to the body from the brain or send sensory signals back into the body from the periphery, from our tactile sensors in our skin, for example. When we look at the brain, we can break it down into different anatomical and functional regions. So here we're looking at a bird's eye view of the brain. Most prominently, we see a deep groove called the longitudinal fissure, which separates the brain into two halves. We call these halves hemispheres. So we have the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And you might have heard people talk about left brain or right brain individuals, but this is sort of a misconception. For the most part, both hemispheres have similar function. There's a bit of lateralization being specialization in function of one hemisphere, but it's minor and it's shaped by the environment. We see it most prominently in regards to language production, which we'll discuss later in the semester. Between the two hemispheres, we have a thick connection called the corpus callosum that allows information to pass back and forth between both sides of the brain. If we cut the corpus callosum, which is sometimes done to treat severe epilepsy, we can observe the effect of this communication pathway. In class, we'll look at what we know about lateralization by exploring these studies, which we call split brain studies.